Please give a warm everybody welcome to our own Dr. Jim S. Williams.
A third term here, intersubjectivity, or the intersubjective, right? A cooperative and communal way of being with others. So along with community, we have cooperation and communalism, adding to this concept of intersubjectivity. So the trajectory here from community to intersubjectivity is expressed by Jackie M. Alexander. And this is a long quote from her, but a very important one, and again, one that resonates with Octavia Butler's work. Think about the immense generosity and immense grace of the earth, she writes. If we were to think about it in a secular way, we would have to think about all the work it takes to produce us. All of the people who have sewn our clothes, made our shoes, harvested our food, all of the people who have produced us just for one morning. Let's not even go through the entire day. She says, let's just take the morning. Consider all the people that it took to produce us that we didn't have a hand in. Those people are part of the undercommons. We didn't have a hand in the rising of the sun. We didn't have a hand in the appearing moon. We didn't have a hand in any of those things. And yet, without them, we wouldn't know life on this planet. So, a nice kind of parable of the sower exercise that I want you to think about right now and have a piece of paper, maybe write it down, and then share with the person next to you, is one thing that has helped to produce your presence here today at the university in this classroom space. Something or someone that has helped to produce that, that you can think of as part of the undercommons, part of your own undercommons. A community, again, of affirmation. A community that is one that expresses that notion, right, of communalism, right, connection. So if everyone can just write down one thing, one idea, one person that has helped to produce you. And let's just take a couple of minutes to do that. Think about something or someone that has helped in this way. Secular or non-secular to produce you. To again make it possible for you to be here.
apologize. That's going to be a little bit sloppy.
Just one thing.
And then
Oh, you just want one off there. It's back. We're going to have to take some off this and some off that. So this is
Okay. All right. So I'm anxious to know what people, what kinds of, what people listed or what people discussed as something or someone that has helped to produce you to make it possible for you to be in this space. Parents. Did it? Yes.
where you were born.
Okay. Where you were born, say more about that.
Like, you don't really have control over like where you're born and like, where you grow up because that's up to your parents. So, but it still like shapes your identity in some way.
How about, did anyone come up with, as you see, Alexander has here the appearing moon and the rising sun, sort of elements of nature.
We talked about water.
Okay, that's excellent. That's an excellent, obviously essential to life. Right? We have to think about not just the people that produce us. The people are important and the places and spaces, as you said, but certainly the elements of nature that Butler is trying to get us to think about our relationship to. Not only just our relationship to each other, but also our relationship to nature, to the planet. This is another concept related to intersubjectivity, and again, Butler's work, collective reflexivity. So seeing ourselves, not only seeing ourselves in each other, in one another, but also seeing ourselves reflected in nature. So, in Butler's work, this concept of collective reflexivity, right? Seeing our connection, seeing how we are reflected by one another, and in the larger and more global sense. She talks about a necessary project of reassembly and reimagination. My quote here is a constant element of supreme self, and the protagonists in Butler's novel are able to very skillfully exhibit this notion of a supreme self. So the individual identity is still important, but also to see that reflected in the collective experience and what she calls here collective reflexivity. And to see that combination of supreme self and collective reflexivity as a pathway of possibility and potential. A potential, again, for transformation, transforming society. She says we begin to see ourselves as others and others in ourselves as a mirror that reflects and connects us. That's my paraphrase. I'm really highlighting the idea of reflection and connection. This creates possibility and potential for growth instead of fear and limitations. The characters have to constantly, the figures in the novel have to constantly overcome the fear and what they can't do and their differences from one another. And again, to see more of a collective reflexivity. So back to the big C word that, again, underlies and really defines the project that Butler is engaged in the novel. Community. So these are some questions for us to consider that Butler is engaging us with. How do we define community? What do we mean when we talk about community? What is the purpose of community? What are the most important aspects of community to you? And sort of thinking critically, are there any limits or restrictions to community? Any negative aspects of community? And what are the benefits of community? And finding how do we create community? I'm going to think about, and we'll come back to those questions. But I want to show another journal entry from Octavia Butler. And one of the things she says is never attack outright, always question. And so she uses the platform of science fiction to insert herself, her supreme self, right, into this project of transformation. Science fiction is a genre, she says, where anything can happen. You can make anything happen. All identities, right, and imaginative identities, right, can be included and part of the landscape, right? And she says, as science fiction is changing, and this is in the early 1970s, it's not likely to change in the racial aspect until more blacks are attracted to the field, and really for her, more women, right? Thinking broadly, thinking about including women and marginalized identities to open up and expand the notion of community. Right? And these are some of the novels in which she envisions these identities that expand, right, the notion of community. In Pattern Master, the early text that she writes, we see characters who are able to bind with other characters telepathically. Right? And this one is really Mind of My Mind is a fun one because that one has a kind of vampire, as you see, parapsychological vampire who seeks to retain control, Doro. But then you have Mary, who's descended from Doro, who has an opposite function in the text. Instead of dominating, she uses her telepathic powers to bring a community together, right? To bring the community of descendants together. And this is an image from Mind of My Mind. And then sort of Mary as this really largesse figure. With a very science fiction, but Afro-futuristic figure that again Butler inserts into the science fiction universe in order to expand the notion of community. And this is a drawing by Butler of what Doro might look like as not a parapsychological vampire, but someone more integrated with the natural world. She actually draws him. Which says she would want Doro to look like this. So she's constantly moving back and forth between the natural landscape and nature and what the science fiction world, through the science fiction genre, what she can imagine, what she can bring into being. So in Parable of the Sower, our text, futuristic, right? Thinking futuristically, using science fiction again to think about community and transformation. She writes, we are earthseed. We are flesh, self-aware, questing, problem-solving flesh. We are that aspect of earth life best able to shape God knowingly. We are earth life maturing, earth life preparing to fall away from the parent world. We are earth life preparing to take root in new ground. Earth life fulfilling its purpose, its promise, its destiny. And it is important to think about the kind of destiny or the kind of future that Octavia Butler is imagining. It is a future of communalism that is enacted through connection. So one of the ideas that you will encounter in the novel, if you haven't already, is hyperempathy syndrome or sharer syndrome. And I argue that Butler uses this as a device to think about, again, what kind of society, transformative society we could imagine in the future through, again, using the science fiction genre. Hyper-empathy syndrome experienced by the protagonist, Laura Olamina, which is a name that is, for us, is supposed to recall a West African identity, West African deities. Allows Lauren to feel the pleasure and pain of others. And I argue that in several of the texts, Mind of My Mind that we saw with the telepathic characters, but also Wild Seed, which is another novel with a character, Anyanwu, who is a shapeshifter, possess special abilities that assist them in rebuilding community. So Lauren has hyperempathy syndrome that is part of this post-apocalyptic world, right? That our children have contracted as a result of their mothers while pregnant taking this drug, Parateco, or what they call the Einstein powder. But the deleterious side effect, and we might think about, is this really deleterious? Is this really a negative side effect? Or is it actually a benefit to the community, right? Is that it allows, gives people the idea, because Butler wanted us to know that it wasn't an actual, that people weren't actually feeling and experiencing the pain and pleasure of others that they were imagining that they were, but it was a strong enough feeling to make it seem very real. And there's still debate about that. That she says Lauren is not empathic, but she feels herself to be. Butler said that in an interview. And you might, when you think about the function of hyperempathy syndrome, we want to question whether or not that is the case. But the metaphorical function of it, right, can be read as a method for Butler to offer new ways of envisioning community and, again, ecological relations. Butler's larger that's eco-feminist purpose is to engender collectivity and collectivism through connection. Lauren feels herself to be empathic because she desperately, along with the other characters, suffers from a loss of connection. right? A loss of connection to other living beings, again, not just human beings, but living beings, and to the land. So that brings us back to what we think of and what we mean, how we define community and the purpose of community. And what is the relationship between identity and community as we've been talking about it in FYE? You've heard a lot of personal stories about identity, but what is that connection to community? And I go back again to Professor Ayala's talk about women's community. What's the relationship between individual identity and that, again, supreme sense of self and the larger community? So I would invite you actually right now to the middle two questions are really important. What are the limits or restrictions to community, or like one negative aspect of community, and what are the benefits to community? We think about what Octavia Butler is trying to achieve in Parable of the Sower, again, trying to achieve this new vision, re-envisioning, right, through this collective reflexivity and supreme self, re-envisioning relations. How does community play into that idea, play into that project? So if you could write down now if you could think of one maybe negative aspect or limit, maybe we can call it a limit or restriction to community, and one benefit to community. And actually talk about that with someone that you're sitting next to. Maybe a different person to turn around in a different. Okay. All right, so I'm curious if people were able to think of negative aspects of community. Because I'm not sure that Octavia Butler sees community in any way as being, and as you move through the novel, you can continue to revisit these questions about community and think about how Octavia Butler is using community as a device for dealing with this post-apocalyptic society. What which I want to end by talking about a little bit about the post-apocalyptic. What did people think about negative? Did anyone have a negative aspect of community?
I said that maybe like you can kind of be held back by other people. It's not up to you, like how far you go. You can kind of like hit a ceiling and other people up in front of you.
That you can be held back by what?
Just like other people, they can like put a ceiling ahead of you. Like just you don't control how far you can go.
You don't control how far you can go. People, there's a ceiling. There's a limitation based on what other people sort of going with.
You said that laws are sort of limits or restrictions to the community. It's not really negative, but it's definitely a restriction. You can't really like go about doing whatever you want.
Laws that dictate how people interact in a community, or laws that.
Just like I guess just like base laws, just like laws that everyone has in their
Because laws are they express what a community should or shouldn't do. Yes.
It can lead you to be closed-minded because you're not exposed to much diversity because you surrounded yourself by people who are exactly like you.
So it can limit diversity. So that yes, that it limits. You're exposed to people who are the same, like-minded, which is something we talked about earlier. That I said earlier.
We talked about how it's, there's a way to do community well, but some people may not do it well.
Well, so these are excellent comments, and they all are. But Butler is anticipating that people will see or think about the restrictions that community that may hinder, right, her more affirming sense of community. She wanna go to this idea. And I don't know what, we would be remiss not to talk about the positive aspects of community. Give me a couple of positive aspects of community that people talked about.
You have structure in what you're doing.
Provide structure. Yeah, so structure and the support, right? Having a support system is important in this post-apocalyptic world that Lauren Olamina and her family are faced with. The limitations for people individually are so intense, so overbearing and overwhelming, that people actually need to find a way to compromise. Some of the things that people talked about as the limitations of community really necessitate what Catherine Ramirez identifies in Butler's work as this need, right, hope for and belief in a community that is founded on trust and cooperation. Some of the interventions to what may seem negative aspects of community have to do with, like a community having, everyone be like-minded and not having diversity. Sort of reaching out and thinking about, again, the courage to be more inclusive, to maybe broaden open the community up, broaden the community, enlarge the community so that is not, doesn't become a negative aspect of community, right? Butler reconceives the idea of the subject, the individual, the supreme self you might think of, through forging links with others that involve acceptance, trust, again, cooperation, compromise and cooperation rather than dominance. So, and that's in a text called Reload, Rethinking Women and Cyberculture. Really, interdependence, community culture, and interdependence you see bold in there are some of the main ideas that Butler is working with in Parable of the Sower. And it is this, in this Undercommons, it's not static. It's the idea of remaking the human. Remaking the human as in revisiting the idea of dominance, right? Trying to, instead of the operative mode of dominance, you have an operative mode of cooperation, of trust, and again, of reflexive collectivity. And a different way, dominance, a different way of thinking about power, right? Of intervening in this notion of unequal power relations. Right? So Butler sees community not as a hindrance, not as something that is restrictive, but as something that is supposed to be freeing. It's supposed to open up avenues, open up possibilities for a new kind of society. Remember at the beginning, new meanings. So some of the new meanings for Butler have to do with redefining this notion of individual identity and selfhood and that relationship to community. So I invite you to think about with Parable of the Sower, the kind of earthseed metaphor. And I go back to Professor Ayala's lecture about what seeds are being planted. What seeds of community are being planted? If you think about the kinds of seeds that Butler wants to be planted, the kind of earth seeds that she's thinking about, the kind of earth seeds that she is emphasizing in the novel. Those earth seeds are, have to do with this discourse, right, of earth life, fulfilling a promise and a destiny, right, of, I said the big word was community, but for Butler also the big C word is change. How can we change, right, in order to fulfill not only a different society or a new society, but one that is going to change this kind of idea of this post-apocalyptic, right, future. The post-apocalyptic, sort of end with post-apocalyptic, but also make it more positive, right? Apocalyptic is sort of where we have this mass deterioration and destruction of the earth, and it's happened in the post-apocalyptic world. How do we then rebuild from that? Right? What is the project? What does it look like to rebuild a post-apocalyptic society? A society where everything has again devolved. So I would. Back to Butler's, right, notion of so be it, see to it. What is your relationship to this project of transformation, and how can you envision in the future ways that the undercommons will be expanded, right? Expanded through the supreme self, connected with the supreme self and a collective reflexivity, right? A communal, open, broad, and transformative right? Future. Okay. Thank you.